As we begin to discuss how to electrify everything in the economy, and that's generally transportation, buildings, and industry, the question arises, how much more electricity will be required? I've read a number of studies, and it's sort of the rule of thumb has been 2 to 3 times, but not everybody agrees with that. And so I thought I'd talk to one of the modeling economists who has dealt with this issue. That's Dr. Chris Bataille. He's with the IDRI Institute in Paris, and he's talking to us from Vancouver. So welcome to the interview, Chris.
Nice to chat with you today, Markham.
So am I correct in saying that as a rule of thumb, 2 to 3 times the electricity we now produce will be needed by, say, 2050, when we've electrified much more of the economy?
Very roughly, yeah. It depends on how much mode shifting we get in personal transport and freight, how fully electrified we go, and how much CCS and biomass we use, but that's about right.
And I suppose that on things like long haul freight, where electrification is maybe not the best option. I think the current thinking is that hydrogen is likely to be the best option, but then, so it's not electric, but then on the other hand, you're using hydrogen to create the electricity if it's made with electrolysis. So I suppose that has to be figured into it as well.
Yeah, and to be honest, the debate is not closed on freight. We very much assumed for a long time it would be biodiesel, but now really we're looking at electrification versus hydrogen fuel cells, and they're both a form of electrification. One's just direct from a battery, and the other one's from hydrogen or fuel cell electricity. However, a really interesting study came out just a few days ago, actually, that 80% of the big trucks that we see are actually running fairly closed circuit loops and are quite amenable to electrification. Most of them are not doing big long haul country runs, which makes it a lot easier to do electrification.
Okay, so you had mentioned to me before that 2 to 3 times the electricity we currently produce for developed economies, but that's even higher for less developed economies.
Yes, and the IEA has done some really good work on this. The first problem developing countries have is just getting enough electricity to run a fully modern economy, like to keep your light manufacturing going, to get a sort of a higher value economy up and running. So most of them need a doubling in electricity generation anyway, just to start with. There's a huge variance in that. But then when you start talking about electrifying the transport fleet, electrifying light industry, what have you, it starts to become something more like 3 to 5 times the amount of generation that they need.
Now, I've had conversations with people who are in the energy industry, but maybe not, they're not modeling economists like you are, who do, back of the cocktail napkin calculations and come up with a much smaller percentage, say like, 20% more electricity if we electrify all of our transportation. What might be the downfall, or the error in taking that approach to calculating electrification needs?
I have never seen 20% in a well-done study. I've seen things like only 50% more, and I've seen bigger numbers like 4 times more, but nothing less than 50 to 75%. Something's missing there in the analysis.
What about the argument that electrification is inherently more efficient than, say, fossil fuels, that you don't waste as much, you do more with the energy that you put into something like heating and transportation? Does that make a big a difference in any of these, amounts that we come up with, like 2 or 3 times?
Oh yeah, no, that factors directly in. So a typical vehicle, internal combustion vehicle, depending on how good it is, how modern and well maintained it is somewhere between 20 and 35% efficient at turning gasoline or diesel into forward motion. Electricity is about 95% efficient, and because the brakes can do brake energy recovery, so you got little magnets there, and they act as basically as electric motors. When you hit the brakes, they put electricity back into the battery. So, but that all gets factored into these estimates.
So going forward, Chris, you were saying earlier before the interview started that this is an area where we need a lot more work. We really, we haven't got studies yet that have looked at, say, Canada or the United States comprehensively, and we've got bits and pieces, and we need to before we can say definitively how much more electricity we need something, we need those comprehensive studies.
Yeah, and a lot of people do have done various slices of this. Progressively, more and more of these studies are coming out. To a certain extent, we need to move on, we need to move on to real life piloting, like of taxi fleets, freight fleets, bus fleets, what have you, and get them out and operating with them and figuring out where they break down, where they work, where they don't work, and then building on that capacity. And that will give us the long-term signal we need to know how much generation, but we really can't go wrong adding as much wind and solar, especially in BC, because we have these big hydro dams to help balance the power going back and forth. We really can't add too much wind and solar for the next decade or so.
So if you were a policymaker, it might be fair to say that, okay, we're going to use the 2 times as a rule of thumb. Let's get working on towards that end. As real-time data comes in, as we get taxi fleets, the examples that you use, then those estimates can be modeled, but we at least have got something to guide us in our early policymaking.
Yeah, and the biggest uncertainties with electrification are not really from, we know what it's going to be, roughly speaking, for the personal transport fleet. Little bit more uncertainty with freight transport. It's industry, how much of industry that we electrify, and how much CCS we use in there, how much bioenergy we use, and what mixes of all 3 of those operating together we use will determine how much electricity we need for the heavy industry system.
Well, it sounds like we're going to need a lot more. Whatever the number is, at the end of the day,
That's very, yes.
it's going to be a lot more, not a little more. So thank you very much, Chris. Always appreciate your insights.
My pleasure. Have a good day.